Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We at AMO are excited to be partnering with Asset Management Ontario to launch this series on making progress in asset management. My name is Erin Orr. I am a program advisor in infrastructure asset management on the CCBF team at AMO. CCBF, as you may know, stands for the Canada Community Building Fund, formerly the Gas Tax Fund. And AMO administers the CCBF. So as part of this work, we provide support for local governments and invest in asset management progress. So this four-part series is focused on supporting the continued progress in asset management within the context of Ontario regulatory requirements. That said, while compliance is, of course, a priority, the main objective is enabling municipalities to advance their asset management programs for effective infrastructure management and long-term planning. So the four sessions that we have are beginning with today's on proposed levels of service and performance, followed by risk assessment, life cycle management and financial strategy, and concluding with a panel on growth. So just quickly, I want to bring us back to this compliance factor. It's twofold. The first is with the Canada Community Building Fund. The CCBF is permanent, predictable, and upfront funding. The federal government directs the funding to be used for priority infrastructure, and asset management is a fantastic tool to identify your community's priorities. So for that reason, asset management is a key principle in the CCBF agreements. The agreements stipulate that recipients should continuously develop and implement an asset management plan and culture in accordance with Ontario regulation. So the Ontario regulation in question is OREG 588/17. Many of you may already be quite familiar with this regulation. It requires all municipalities in Ontario to advance their asset management programs, and it is pretty prescriptive with deadlines for policies and plans. Most of the deadlines are behind us, though we know that many municipalities may be a little bit delayed as they are slowly but surely working to improve their infrastructure data and information. So I'm going to provide just a quick summary of these deadlines. The first was in 2019, and this is for the asset management policy. The second deadline was in 2022, and this was for the first iteration of the asset management plan. This was to include a summary of the current level of service for your core assets. That's roads, bridges, water, sanitary, storm. The next deadline was last year. So on July 1st of 2024, the second iteration of the asset management plan was due. And this is to include all of your assets. So a current level of service summary for your buildings, facilities, machinery, equipment, fleet, land improvement assets, and the like. Now the final deadline is this year. On July 1st of 2025, the last iteration of the asset management plan is due. And this plan is to include the proposed levels of service. That is in addition to your current levels of service. Proposed levels of service can be understood as your desired levels of service. And this plan is to include a 10-year financial and management strategy that identifies exactly how you're going to achieve your desired levels of service, whether that is to maintain, reduce, improve upon, whatever it is your community determines. So after all of these deadlines have been met, every municipality is expected to review and renew their asset management plan and policy at least every 5 years. So that does mean that your 2019 asset management policy is due for renewal. We are hoping that these sessions, including today's, provide some additional support in achieving this compliance, particularly for the 2025 asset management plan. So before I hand it off to Jennifer Court from Asset Management Ontario, I want to share other resources that we have available at AMO. So we do have other asset management webinars and courses available and accessible on our website. We are also currently updating a lot of our research on asset management in Ontario. We're building an interactive map that links to all active asset management plans. This is continuously being updated as you continuously update your plans. We're hoping that it is in its best condition by this summer. And then we're also doing an analysis on the asset management plans that are in action right now, compiling more information on maturity as well through the asset management questionnaire. You may have already encountered this as part of your CCBF reporting in 2024. And then finally, please know that you can contact us at any time with any questions, or if you're just seeking guidance on your asset management program development. So with that, I am happy to send it off to Jennifer Court, who will be introducing today's session and panelists.
Thanks a lot, Erin. So as Erin said, I'm Jen Court, Executive Director of Asset Management Ontario, and welcome to session 1 of our 4-part series. Today, we're focused on proposed levels of service and performance. We have 2 great speakers for you today, Troy Mander and Kareem Mustafa, who will introduce in more detail in a moment. But first, just a few details. We will be saving time for a Q&A at the end of the session. So that'll be for both speakers at the very end. Please use the Q&A box for your questions. In the meantime, some of you have started this already, but please feel free to introduce yourself to other attendees in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're joining from. Thanks to those of you who came in and kicked that right off. I know you're all dying to know, yes, the slides will be available. We will be posting everyone's presentations as well as a recording of today's session on the AM Ontario event page following the webinar. There may be just a slight delay while we get that up, but it will be available as soon as possible. I have posted that link in the chat, and I'll post it again at the end of the session. So with that said, I'm happy to introduce our first presenter, Troy Mander, who is a Senior Advisor with Asset Management Ontario. Troy has nearly 40 years of experience in asset management and infrastructure planning. At the region of Peel, Troy was the public works lead in the planning and budgeting of a multi-billion-dollar 10-year growth and non-growth roads, water, and wastewater capital plan, water and wastewater master plans, and development charge background studies. In the final decade of his career at Peel, Troy led a successful mission to develop the region's corporate asset management strategy, proposed levels of service, and internal processes to determine the financial requirements to sustain Peel's 30 billion plus in assets. And currently, Troy works part-time for AM Ontario as a senior advisor. So with that, I will turn it over now to Troy. Take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As Erin was saying, the July 2025 compliance requirements are intended for municipalities to develop sustainable financial plans that consider both the operating and capital costs required to achieve proposed levels of service. So the key requirements for July 1st, 2025 include proposed levels of service that are selected by each municipality for each of their asset categories and services. Risk assessments tied to achieving the service requirements. This will be discussed on March 20th. Life cycle management strategies outline the operating and capital requirements and costs to achieve proposed levels of service. And a financial strategy that outlines how the municipality will support the 10-year asset management plan and mitigate the unfunded risks. The life cycle management strategy and financial strategy will be discussed on March 27th. So, but as we were saying earlier, identifying appropriate and effective proposed levels of service are the foundation to achieving all of the July 2025 compliance requirements. So proposed levels of service are determined by each municipality, but at a minimum, municipalities need to ensure that the community and technical levels of service are reasonable and can provide safe, adequate, and accessible services to the public. Therefore, it's very important that the municipality selects levels of service that properly describe the community services and the asset management or the asset measures and requirements to deliver the services. So I want to note that the focus of proposed levels of service is to provide safe, adequate, and accessible services. This may not be affordable for the municipality, at least in the near term. However, in line with the legislation, the objective is to document the proposed levels of service in the asset management plan, and then assess through the financial strategy what proposed levels of service are feasible and affordable, and which ones are not, and outline for those levels of service that aren't feasible or affordable, how you're going to manage the risks associated with that. Skipped one. Okay, so levels of service are one component of the asset management strategy, and have an integrated role in risk management, life cycle strategies, and life cycle costs. Decisions guided by the constant push and pull of these factors result in the maximization of asset value in providing services. So first, a quick recap on levels of service. Levels of service are measures that are used to describe the current and desired state of the assets and services. In the context of asset management, levels of service need to be structured to provide information and make decisions on how the assets are supporting the services. Community levels of service are qualitative measures that describe the services and how they're delivered to the community. Technical levels of service are quantitative measures that describe the asset's technical requirements to meet the community levels of service targets. AM Ontario further breaks down technical levels of service into asset levels of service and operations and maintenance levels of service. We do this because the asset management regulation requires that the 10-year asset management plan include full life cycle costs, full life cycle capital, and significant operating costs for all of the assets. So the proposed asset levels of service inform the asset's capital requirement costs, and the proposed operations and maintenance levels of service inform the operating requirements and costs. So a brief overview on current versus proposed technical levels of service. First, it's important to note that the technical levels of service selected should typically follow industry precedent or best practices to the extent possible, and that the levels of service measures can be applied consistently across all of the assets in the asset class. So current levels of service are determined based on the average level of service rating of all the assets in the asset class. And the proposed levels of service are selected by the municipality, and again should ensure safe, adequate, efficient, effective, and accessible services. So before going any further though into the levels of service, I wanted to step back a little bit to explain more about the role of proposed levels of service in the asset management strategy, starting with risk management. Shown here is an organizational risk hierarchy. At the base of the hierarchy, the current asset levels of service are measured against their proposed asset levels of service. The variance between the current and proposed levels of service dictate the level of risk to the assets and to the services, which in turn dictates the risk to achieving the organizational service objectives. The ability to measure asset risk to services and service objectives allows a comparative prioritization of all the asset types in a consistent manner across the organization. The risk management presentation on March 20th will provide greater detail on these connections between asset levels of service and enterprise risk management. Technical levels of service also dictate asset lifecycle strategies and the financial plan. As you can see here, the proposed technical levels of service guide the asset lifecycle strategy by dictating when treatment activities should be applied to maintain desirable service levels to the community. Life cycle strategy in turn dictates the whole life cycle cost, which in turn informs the long-range financial plan. The proposed technical levels of service should guide optimal intervention strategies to maintain, rehabilitate, replace assets at least overall cost while providing the desired levels of service to the community. And again, this will be discussed further on March 27th. So getting back to technical levels of service, as already mentioned, technical levels of service are the foundation for integrated decision-making on risk priority setting, lifecycle management, and financial planning. Therefore, it's very important that the proposed technical levels of service that are selected by the municipality can be effectively utilized for integrated decision-making. They can be readily understood and are grounded in defensible precedent. So I'll provide some examples as we go through the presentation. In summary, there needs to be a clear connection between the desired service levels to the public and the asset's technical requirements to deliver the services. The line of sight is critical for identifying and prioritizing asset needs within the context of the organization's entire asset portfolio, and to understand the risks and costs associated with each of the assets. The strategic service measures are sourced from the strategic plan, service reviews, public surveys, and other public service documentation. The technical levels of service should be sourced where possible from established industry precedents such as regulations, typical standards, design guidelines, and best practices. Now I'll run through a couple of examples connecting community levels of service, community levels of service to technical level of service requirements. So in this case, we're looking at the roads or transportation service. The community levels of service selected by the municipality is safe, reliable, and accessible roads. Now, AM Ontario breaks down asset levels of service into two categories: condition asset levels of service, which measure the condition or health of the assets, and performance asset levels of service, which measures the adequacy of the asset's design or fit for purpose to meet service requirements. So to set a proposed condition asset level of service for roads, the municipality is using the pavement condition index, which is a typical industry measure to determine what are safe, reliable roads. To set the performance asset level of service target, the municipality specifies a conformance to the geometric design standards for Ontario highways, which is a determination of what is a safe and reliable road network. And finally, to set a proposed operations and maintenance level of service, the municipality uses the provincial minimum maintenance standards, which support safe, reliable, and accessible roads year-round. So in each of those cases, you can see that precedents are being used to set those levels of service targets. Now, another example using the water service, and this is a little bit different. The community level of service selected by the municipality is adequate, reliable, clean water. Now, to set the proposed condition asset level of service, the municipality's council has accepted that a maximum of 2 water main breaks per pipe section is sufficient to affordably support safe, reliable water. So in this case, the condition level of service is a discretionary target that's been selected by council. Again, there's some precedent or some backing behind that selection for a level of service. To set a proposed performance asset level of service, the municipality specifies the Ministry of Environment design guidelines, which define adequate capacity for peak domestic use and fire flows, and both of which would support adequate, reliable water. And finally, to set a proposed operations maintenance level of service, municipality specifies annual flushing of cul-de-sacs and dead ends per their operational plan under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So here's an example of AM Ontario's level of service template, which documents the services, service objectives, community levels of service, the supporting assets, and the assets that are supporting those services, and then the current and proposed technical levels of service. And there you can see them all in one location and see where you can see a clear line of sight between services down to the asset requirements to deliver those services. Outlined underneath the table are the high-level performance rating descriptions that help users to consistently rate the performance of their assets and to select their proposed performance asset level service targets. So now I want to talk a little bit about the difference between key performance indicators and technical levels of service. It's quite common to see levels of service and key performance indicators used interchangeably. However, there's important distinctions between the two, each having very different decision-making purposes. Proposed technical levels of service set consistent targets against which all assets in the asset class can be consistently measured and deficient assets identified, asset risks measured, and life cycle actions recommended. Key performance indicators, on the other hand, are used to measure trends in asset and service conditions to determine if the conformance to the proposed technical levels of service are leading to the desired outcomes the municipality is looking for. Unlike proposed technical levels of service, KPIs do not provide insight on the conditions of specific assets, indicate the levels of asset risk, or inform on preferred asset lifecycle strategies or actions. So I'm going to give some examples of selecting good and poor proposed levels of service. So first, an example of a good condition asset level of service or proposed conditional asset level of service. In this case, the asset level of service that's been selected is maintain recreational facilities at a facility condition index of 5%, which equates to good. So the decisions you're getting from this are it sets a clear target that states that every facility not meeting 5% FCI or better requires some sort of a capital upgrade. It provides a measure for determining the risk at each facility. It's using a common industry standard. FCI is a fairly common standard that's comparable across all industries. And it says to the community that safe, efficient, and accessible facilities are important to the municipality. So now an example of a poor proposed condition level of service. And in this case, it would be maintain the average FCI of the recreation facility portfolio at 5% or good. So the decision outcomes are incomplete or kind of mixed on what you're going to get from this type of a level of service. It does not state or require that all buildings need to be to the same standard. So in other words, some can be very good and some can be very poor, but as long as they all balance or average out at good, then you're technically meeting that asset level of service. It's not saying to the community that all buildings are valued equally and maintained to the same standard. And potentially you're understating severe needs and risks within the portfolio. If you've got, one outlier building that's in really bad shape, for instance, while there are a bunch are in good shape. So it's kind of washing or watering down potential risks and severe risks within the portfolio. And now I'll provide a couple of examples of good and poor operating maintenance levels of service. So a good example of an operating maintenance level of service is stating precisely activities like public spaces are in recreation facilities are cleaned daily. The interior of the facilities are painted every 4 years. Critical systems are inspected and tested each month. So each of these levels of service define specific operating activities and frequency, set a benchmark against which to evaluate, calculate, and validate operating costs, and says to the community that clean, safe, appealing facilities are important to the municipality. An example of a poor operating maintenance level of service would be maintain a average operating cost of facilities at X dollars per square meter. So again, the decision outcome is unclear. It does not specify the specific activities or targets necessary to maintain facilities at desired levels of service. It doesn't provide transparency to analyze what's driving costs and what can be adjusted to manage those costs, whether to move things up, move things down, and what's even appropriate to maintain in terms of an operating service. And it does not state what's valuable to the customer, which is, again, clean, safe, appealing facilities. So bringing everything together, I just want to show how selecting the right proposed asset levels of service or proposed levels of service and measures lead to effective decision outcomes. So starting with service objectives, a municipality may want to understand if the recreation centers are meeting the community needs. This might be measured by how much of the facility capacity is being utilized and the adequacy of revenues. Next, the municipality will want to understand how the customer perceives the recreation services and if they are affordable and meeting specific needs. This might be measured by registration rate and space utilization for the different programs. Next, the municipalities will want to understand how the asset conditions could affect the desirability and effectiveness of the services to the community. And this can be measured by the condition of each facility and how they are performing in terms of adequacy, flexibility, and the environment of the spaces. And finally, the municipality will want to understand if the ongoing maintenance of the facilities is adequate to maintain safety and desirability, and if the costs are sustainable. So in each of these cases, the measures lead to actionable decision outcomes. Now, just a quick review. We've already talked about many of these tips in selecting technical levels of service, but again, you want to ensure that critical assets are given a higher technical level of service targets. Generally good. You want to equate them to good. Use precedent as much as possible when selecting your measures and targets. And that way you've got some sort of support or backing behind the selection of those measures and targets. Focus on selecting effective technical levels of service. So make sure that whatever the levels of service you're selecting, they tell a story about the asset. They effectively measure those measure the assets and lead to good decision outcomes. And the measures should be able to be applied consistently across each of the assets in the asset class. Okay, so I just want to quickly cover how AM Ontario's asset or level of service strategy works, and perhaps might be a takeaway that could help inform your municipality's approach to setting proposed levels of service. So AM Ontario uses 5 asset level of service types. The first type is condition, which uses typical industry condition measures where possible. The next 4 are performance asset level services. Operational functionality is the first one, which uses criteria related to such things as efficiency and effectiveness of the assets, compliance with standards and regulations, and relevance of technology. The next performance level service type is capacity meet demands, which uses criteria to assess the asset's ability to meet current service demands. The next one is operational resiliency, which uses criteria to assess the provision of backup systems and surplus capacity for emergency situations, as well as having adequate security for assets and people. And finally, environmental resiliency, which uses criteria to assess the protection of assets from natural environmental threats or threats from climate change. So behind all of these, AM Ontario provides criteria for establishing the proposed performance asset level service targets in order that you can assess each of your assets under these categories. And then this table illustrates how each of AM Ontario's levels of service support specific desired service outcomes for the community. And this slide finally illustrates the intersection between AM Ontario's level of service strategy and AM Ontario's risk management strategy. For both the condition and performance asset levels of service, you can see that there's a corresponding likelihood of failure ratings. And as you can see, the likelihood of asset failure to provide safe, effective services increases as the condition and performance of the assets decrease. So as the conditions of each asset deteriorate, your likelihood of failure will increase. So a new simplified level service package will be available later this month from AM Ontario, but in the meantime, AM Ontario has existing class-based tools that are available upon request. So if there's a desire for a municipality to use some of this stuff in setting their proposed levels of service, you're welcome to contact Jennifer about getting some of these packages. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kareem and Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Troy. And yes, we can talk more about the packages, but they are free and available. All right, so with that, our next presenter is going to be Kareem Mustafa from the City of Ottawa. Kareem currently serves as one of the leaders of the strategic asset management team at the City of Ottawa. He worked on delivering the asset management plans for the city's core and non-core assets in accordance with OREG 58817. Before that, he was at the University of Waterloo, where he worked on automating asset management and infrastructure prioritization plans for the university's plant operations office, the Toronto District School Board, and others. So with that, I will turn it over to Kareem.
Just make sure to unmute yourself, Kareem.
Okay. Can you see and hear? Can you see the presentation and hear me okay?
All good.
All right. Well, good afternoon. My name is Kareem Mustafa, and we're gonna talk about proposed level of service and performance. And for the sake of the discussion, we're mainly focused on the technical or the asset level of service, as Troy discussed in the previous presentation. Okay, so a bit of background on the City of Ottawa. We're huge. We have a very big land size. As you can see, we can fit Toronto, Edmonton, Calgary, Montreal, and Vancouver. And therefore, we have a very huge asset portfolio. We have over 12,000 kilometers of roads, to 2,600 kilometers of sidewalks and pathways, 8,000 kilometers of pipes. That includes water, wastewater, and stormwater, 600 acres of parks, and about 9 million square feet of building space. We've not always been that huge. We've been pretty fragmented until 2001, and since the amalgamation, we have gone through a a long asset management journey. We have started doing long-range financial plans since 2002. We do master plans for different asset classes. As per the OREG 588, we've had a comprehensive asset management program and comprehensive asset management policy starting 2012, and we update it regularly. And we have the city of, of course, we have retired now in favor of the asset management plans. And thanks to 588.17, we now have 4 asset management plans that we have published. 2022, non-core in 2024, and now working on the updates for these asset management plans. Interestingly enough, where we live as capital planning and strategic asset management team, we live within the infrastructure and water services, so we quote unquote report to the city's chief engineer as opposed to being in finance as most of other municipalities. It has its own pros and cons. We're closer to the assets, but we're away from the money side. So it is a different flavor of asset management that we operate under based on the connections that we have. And these are samples of the different asset management plans that we're doing. And the reason there's so many is we chose to split them by service areas. So you have libraries, you have government services, you have emergency protective services, as opposed to having one asset management plan for all the facilities, one asset management plan for all fleet, for example. We have seen this as a way to better generate discussions and better articulate outcomes and levels of service. Speaking of level of service, all of us now know how to calculate our current level of service or current performance, which is how our assets are performing right now. Now, the question is, what would the future look like? So if you look back at the 588.17, you will find that for them, when they talk about proposed or target level of service, they talk about something that you can explain, that you can justify how that level of service came in place. Why did you choose these thresholds? So based on the current level of service, we can diverge into one of 2 paths. And in Ottawa, we've done both. You can take the proposed or target level of service, which is how your assets would perform if you do everything right, if you finish up your backlog, if you do everything the building condition audit says. How would your portfolio and how your asset will perform accordingly? And you would have sort of an expected or forecast level of service, which is how your asset will perform if you do the best you can given your different constraints, financial status, and any other policy and procedure that might limit you from achieving the let's call it the best practice for operation and maintenance. Again, a more detailed comparison between the two. So the proposed level of service or the target level of service, as the OREG requires, is how the asset will perform if you do everything on time in terms of renewal and rehabilitation, and if you're achieving other municipal targets on time, for example, GHG emissions or growth or anything else. Versus expected, which is you'll be doing the best you can with the money you have, and how would that reflect on the asset performance? When we talk about modeling those 2 performances, we're looking into like an unconstrained for the proposed or the targets. We're looking for constrained for the expected. If you want to use different phrasing to articulate them for people who are not asset management savvies, you can use the word aspired or intended to talk about the proposed level of service versus the word forecasted when you talk about the expected level of service. And in the case of Ottawa Asset Management Plan, we discuss the proposed level of service within the level of service section, the level of service chapter, when we compare current to aspired or current versus targets. And we talk about expected when we talk about funding analysis, because we're saying the difference between these levels of service translates into the funding gaps, and how would that frame our future financial conversations. So now the questions become, how do we calculate and how do we find out these different levels of service? So let's start with the proposed. For the proposed level of service, one way to do them is your proposed level of service is whichever target being set by a different legislation or different plan, whether that's coming from city council or from higher orders of government like municipal or federal. Examples, like for example, Council has approved that Ottawa is targeting reaching zero GHG emissions by 2050. So if you have a level of service of GHG emissions by facilities, you can sort of interpolate and have your target for the 2033 or the 2034, which is the end of your forecast for the amps. Other examples that are done either federal or municipal or provincial would include like paramedic response time, water quality metrics that are being sort of imposed by the drinking water quality manual, and so on and so forth. So you can use whichever target being set on you and interpolate that to your target level of service to ensure consistency. A different alternative is if you do an unconstrained life cycle modeling, you can use these results to indicate what your target level of service would be. An example would be what would be the proposed average condition for facilities if you do every renewal that the building condition audit suggests. Or going back to the previous presentation, what would be the condition of your water network if you actually follow the state of good repair and you do all renewals and you flush and for the wastewater network you flush your cul-de-sacs annually as the operation manual suggests. When all else fails, you have a qualitative option, which is option 3. If you can't really find a quantitative number for methods 1 and 2, you can go with a qualitative narrative, whether it's maintain or improve a current performance. An example for that would be number of road collisions per 100,000 people, or number of bridges with load restriction. These are things that have too many variables in place that you can't really do a diligent quantitative assessment or a quantitative forecast to see how these would look like and how these are intended to look like in 10 years. Moving on to expected level of service, these are relatively easy because all of us are already doing this in one way, shape, or form. Like we have already forecasted project within our regular budgets. We have forecasted project within our long-range financial plans based on our financial constraints and based on other council directions. We can translate those and see how these would affect our current asset performance. And these would be the expected level of service because these are what we can do and what we intend to do. Or going back to method number 2, in the proposed level of service, if you're able to do an unconstrained life cycle model to get your forecasted or to get your proposed or your target level of service, you can do a constrained model to get your expected or your forecast. Now, how did everything get tied together? As you can see here, there is always a relationship between the level of service and the funds. So if you have more money, you can have a better level of service or better performance. Less money or bigger gaps, you have a lower performance, which corresponds ultimately to a higher risk. So if we have an example and we see the performance here is somewhere between 1 and 100, your proposed level of service would be all the way up, close to 100, 100% even in some cases. But you would have the expected level of service a bit less, and that difference would be quantified as sort of your funding gap. This is how much I can reach. However, I would like to have a better levels or better performance, but I can't because of the different constraints. So you can start asking questions like, how much does it cost to actually reach my proposed level of service? And this would be the funding gap. And given the amount of money that I have, what is the level of service I'm expecting from my assets, given my budget and given my other constraints? And for those might be wondering where the current level of service would lie, typically it lies somewhere in the middle. For most municipalities, unfortunately, with a backlog growing over and over, typically your current level of service would kind of drop within the expected level of service because of the funding constraints. If you're among the lucky ones that have a budget that can able to catch up with your rate of deterioration, then you might see a slight improvement within the expected, but not as much as reaching the proposed. Now let's look at some examples. So you see, as the graph on the left, can see an example of an asset level of service, which is the percentage fair or better of a pipe network. And you can see the blue line going down, which is what would be the expected or the forecasted level of service given your budget constraints, versus an unconstrained scenario, which would be representing your target or proposed or aspired level of service. And you can see that difference is kind of difference related to the funding. If you look to the graph to your right, you see now the financial information that talks about all this. So you see the different bars, which corresponds to the needs you have to work on in terms of rehabilitation renewals. And you see there is a huge spike at the very beginning because, as we mentioned, part of having the proposed level of service is clearing all your backlog. So you would be assuming you'll be clearing this in year one, or you can have your own assumptions, and then you start moving forward, kind of having a clean slate and move forward for the future years. And then you'd see the difference between sort of the 10-year average, which is the horizontal dark green line, versus your budget, which is the orange line underneath it. And this would be sort of your funding gap. You can measure, you can tally this up over the 10 years, and you have your 10-year funding gap, or you can have an annual funding gap and report on that. Or you can have a different discussion with this graph. So saying now that I know the performance given my given my budget, the expected performance, what would the expected performance be if I start manipulating the budget a little bit? I can start having a 7% increase, a 5% increase, a 10% increase, and see how that would affect my performance. And maybe you can reach some middle ground where it's acceptable. You're not all the way up to target, but at the same time, you're not overly burdening the municipalities or the citizens to reach that target. You can find some sort of a middle ground that both the technical aspect and the policy-making aspect can agree upon. This is an example, actually, not from Ottawa, but actually from the city of Calgary. So if we walk through this, you can see that they started up with the current level of service, which is 38% of their network is at a good condition, 36 at fair, 26 at poor condition, and they highlight the current funding that they get, which is the $40 million per year. You go down to the proposed level of service, and they kind of give one of the two. So they had a proposed level of service which is having 60% of the roads in a very good condition, and this translated to needing $132 million per year. Another proposed level of service would have been how much money would we need if we want to have half the network at a very good condition, and that translates to the fact that we would need $160 million a year between now and 2034. Now you go all the way down and you see the expected level of service, which is what would the road network look like if we kept getting the same $40 million a year that we keep getting between now and 2034. And you see that the performance drops. So instead of 38% of the road network in good condition, it drops all the way to 26. And most importantly, the amount of roads that are in poor condition doubles from 26% of the road network all the way up to 52%. So as we understand, it's very unlikely that we would be tripling taxes to go from $40 million up to 132. It is beneficial to show these different numbers to facilitate the discussion and see how would we reach a middle ground that give us a healthy network and at the same time without overburdening the taxpayers. Now, where do we go from here? What we would like to do is rely more on the quantitative analyses for proposed level of service. So having more methods ones and twos, either connecting to other targets from city council or higher orders of government, or having more quantitative and more modeling based levels of service. Revisit and update the life cycle models to have a more accurate representation of the actual performance, so we can have a better forecast of future performance. Be more able to cost the different levels of service, so we can have those financial discussions with more accuracy and more confidence. And finally, as Erin mentioned earlier, we can start looking into level of service performance levels that would be published by other municipalities, because now you can have another method to develop your proposed level of service, which is, this is kind of the state of practice that neighboring municipal or sister municipalities are having. If this is the kind of the law of the land, everyone, let's say, for example, agreeing on PQI of 70. So this would be our proposed level of service, and this would be what we would be working on. And before I leave you, before I conclude, I'll leave you with this. So the main difference, the proposed level of service would be the future we would wish for if everything is working well for us. But the expected level of service is the future we were able to achieve given the different constraints, whether it's financial or others. And now, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kareem. I think really great demonstration about how connected the levels of service are to the budget. And as Troy highlighted, also to the risk. You can't do one piece without considering all the others. So now we're going to go to our Q&A. So we do have a couple of questions already in the Q&A box. I will just direct everyone again to that Q&A function if you do have additional questions. So let's start with one. There was a question in the chat. There's sort of a related question in the Q&A box. Let's just talk very briefly about resources. So Troy mentioned at the end of his presentation, we do, as a part of this series, have a new resource in development. It's a bit more of a simplified, streamlined version of our existing levels of service and performance tool, incorporating that proposed element. That's going to be available by session 4. We'll be making an announcement and doing our launch. We do also have a suite of tools that have been developed over the course of our collaboration together with AMO over the past 5+ years. Those are all Excel-based tools. So a lot of the slides that Troy was showing are based on that, on those Excel-based models that we have available. So I will post a link to that in the chat before we break. They were shared as part of our 2024 webinar series. Troy, if you want to add anything to that, please feel free. Okay. So question in the chat about reporting format or guide. Those resources, those tools, those free tools are a great start for doing that in-house. That's the intent. And then I think as all of our presenters shared, looking at what comparable municipalities have done is also a great starting point. So going to the Q&A box, we just had a new question come in. A good proposed asset level of service for water pipelines could be 70% of water pipelines in good or better condition. However, even if the current status indicates that 85% of water pipes meet this condition, it may not provide the full picture. For instance, if just 1% of the total pipe length represents a highly critical section of a main feeder pipe in poor condition, the system could be at significant risk. What about incorporating criticality as the asset system level into the ALOS? Then a more comprehensive ALOS might be 70%. Oh, that question just, here we go. 70% of water pipes in good or better condition and 90% of highly critical pipe sections in good or better condition. This approach would require assessing criticality of the entire pipe network using consequence of failure analysis at the system network level. Does this revised ALOS make sense? Thoughts from either Troy or Kareem? Does someone want to dive in? I saw Troy unmuting.
So, yeah, so this kind of goes back to that example, that asset level of service, where you're saying 70% of the network is at good or whatever. But as you say, it doesn't account for the good pipes and the bad pipes. So it's better to set a defined target. So you want all of your pipes in good condition, and whatever that good condition score is, and then whatever pipes don't meet that condition target, those are the ones you focus in on. And by defining what type of pipe it is, so if it's a feeder main, then that's a very critical pipe. So it's in an asset class of its own. You'd want to ensure that it has a higher level of service than, say, your distribution pipes. which you might say, okay, so for an example, because transmission mains or feeder mains are critical pipes, you might say have a asset level of service of no breaks for those pipes. With your distribution system, you might allow 1 or 2 breaks on a pipe before you replace it. So that gives you that ability to assign criticality through assigning pipes to the proper asset classes, critical assets versus less critical assets. And then each of those pipes within the asset, or each of those assets within the asset class are consistently measured against a common standard. And then whatever that standard is, whatever is above a standard, you move on. Whatever's below the standard, look at what you need to do to address it and how much risk is associated with it.
Thanks, Troy.
Hopefully that
Kieran?
helps.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kieran,
Sure,
did you have
yeah.
anything you wanted to add to that?
Sure. I said it all actually, but I would echo like it's a very interesting, it's a very good approach of dealing with level of service. This is also the reason why we try to report on percentage good or better, as opposed to having an average condition for the network, because an average condition of 3 doesn't really tell you the full story. You can have so many 5s that you need to work on. Similar to Troy mentioned, it all goes back to how you classify your assets, because you will also need to consider that into your inventory. So you have, for example, 3,000 kilometers of water network, 100 kilometers or whatever is your high critical features. You will have to highlight those very carefully and very explicitly from the get-go. And this is all something we're doing in Ottawa. Like if you look into into our asset management plans now and the version that will go on, you will see, for example, for water network, we have small versus large water mains, which showcases the distribution versus transmission. If you look into the wastewater, you will have them by size, and you have force mains, for example, as its own asset type, and so on and so forth. So it all goes back to the story you're telling, and it's not about just putting in a level of service. You'll have to tie it into the whole story that you're trying to do with your asset management plan, because this ties to your inventory and ties into finances.
Exactly. All right. Unfortunately, we are going to have to cut short there. We did have a few questions that Troy answered in the chat box. You can open up that Q&A, or sorry, in the Q&A box, you can open that up and take a look. And I will say we are going to be continuing this discussion in our next series. It all really ties together. So thank you so much to our presenters, and thank you to everyone for attending today. Our next session is on March 20th, after the March break. So we're taking a break next week. We are coming back on March 20th, and we will be talking about risk as that connects to all of these other topics. So some good continuity there. If you're not already registered, you can do so from our event page. It's that same link that I shared at the beginning of the session. I'll post it really quickly again before we break. If you're looking for additional support or access to AM Ontario's Excel-based tools and resources, please do feel free to reach out, and I look forward to seeing everybody again on March 20th.